Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Matt Duggan. He is the author of a new series whose name I have. It is Ostraca and In Extremis as part of the Rosie Dream trilogy. That is Rosie, right? Let me put my glasses on for a second. Yes.
Yep.
Um, and uh, and it is set in the late 20th century, and so it's fiction. So we're going to have a chat about that and find out more about these great new books. So welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, excellent. So, why don't we dive right in? Why don't you tell us about the series and the books you have out and what people expect when they open the page?
Yeah, sure. So exactly as you said, it's a trilogy, and the first book, Ostraca, was published in 2019. It's in the genre of literary fiction. I like to say it follows along the lines of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. It's inspired by Kerouac, Henry Miller, as far as its literary fiction style. It's the story of a young man who's trying to figure out his way in the world, asking the deep philosophical existential questions while simultaneously having to live day to day and make money to pay his rent and get through the day. So he has his sort of intellectual side, but it crashes with the reality of having to pay for your gas and so on. And so Ostraka is the first book. I'm about to publish In Extremis, which is the second novel in the series. And In Extremis, Ostraka, the first novel, the character, it's basically a road trip story. He goes from New York to Los Angeles, and In Extremis takes place from his time in Los Angeles on once he's settled. And then the sort of core driving force of the story is the protagonist. He lost both his parents when he was 7 years old. That's really driving his quest to find out, what's the meaning and purpose of my existence.
Oh, well, heady topics for sure. That's a
Yeah.
lot, even in fiction. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your process, how you write, how all that works?
Yeah. So I started off, um, I was a writing major in college, but I moved out to Los Angeles. I started off as an actor and had some success, but wasn't artistically satisfied. So I turned my focus to writing, and that was screenwriting. And when I drove across the country in 1996, the experience, I camped out most of the way, and that experience really stayed with me. I had pretty wild experiences along the way. And so I was writing about it, and I figured all these years later, it was like an itch, an artistic itch. I really wanted to turn that into a novel and express some of the deeper ideas, thoughts that I'd been carrying around with me artistically. And so that's what led me to novel writing. And I found the format of the novel to be just extraordinarily freeing for artistic expression. And that's sort of where I just turned my focus as a writer to.
No, certainly. What do you think is the biggest difference between screenplay writing and novel writing?
It's a great question. So, and it's funny you say that because I just have noticed in a couple of films really paying attention to that. So the first is um, with a screenplay, you're writing for the 70 by 30-foot screen, so it's purely visual. Whereas a novel is, to me, there's such an incredible intimacy, and so your timing is so funny with that question. I just happened to watch The Big Sleep, and I had read the novel beforehand, and it was this perfect example. The film with Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, it's amazing because of them. But reading Chandler's novel and the detail, the intimacy of it, his insights, descriptions of the characters, that's to me where the real kind of brilliance of the novel is compared to the screenplay. I've been a screenwriter for years. I love that format, But the novel, with a screenplay, it's cut dialogue, cut dialogue, cut dialogue. And with a novel, if you're doing it right, if you're following the your voice, if you're serving your audience, you can have 400, 500 pages and engross your audience in that because you're getting in, you can be sharing your characters' thoughts, their feelings, whereas on screen, that's all expressed through imagery and a character's slightest movement.
Well, yes, and I mean certainly a difference in who, film is a director's medium, not a writer's medium.
Yes, exactly.
So the screenplay, takes, I mean, the moment the cameras start rolling, the screenplay sort of fades away into the visuals and ad libs and all this sort of thing. And it's always a fun exercise. I don't know if they still do this in film school or not, but to read a screenplay along with a movie and see all the ways in which they changed or people said things differently. And that's I did that for my MFA. I did that with Gone with the Wind. I found an old bound version of the original script
Oh,
to go
wow.
along with the movie. Yeah. And it was yeah. Vivian Lee can't memorize lines. People don't know that, but she just kind of looked at the script and then was kind of like, "That's lovely. I'll say some stuff that sounds like that," and kind of went her own way. And
So
so
did you notice a lot that the script, that what was on the screen didn't match what was already originally on the page?
yeah,
Oh,
it's more
wow.
common than you think. Like if you ever have a chance, you'll be surprised at how many things got changed in the moment, or yeah, that's not the right line, but it was a really good take, so we're gonna keep it, sort of thing. Um, there's great people, and now with YouTube, people point them out a lot where different things were ad-libbed or changed in the moment because it worked better and all that type of thing. And so, I think the
Well,
director
so
lives in fear if the screenwriter ever shows up to the film set. That's
yeah,
that's how. So
you're making one of the big points too about the differences between the two mediums is the novel allows the writer to really exist in his or her world, where is it's really the director's medium for film, and the director is going to accomplish their vision as they want and see it, and the page is a bit of a, it's just a guide. And I think that can be the really big challenge. And no, some screenwriter friends, nothing exists before they put the story on the page, but they don't necessarily get the respect, at the end of the process that is really due to them. And I've had some of my own experiences, which is, I think, what brought me back. I think where I found such a sanctuary in the novel format, because you don't have to be beholden or held hostage to the whims of uh, the ego of an actor or a producer who says, there's budget realities, right? With a novel, um, you can go as to the furthest universe you want, and there's not going to be a producer who's going to say, yeah, well, we only have 2 more days left to shoot this section. We can't afford that. And so that to me is the other really freeing thing about the novel.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Although in working in publishing, we do sometimes have to have very terse conversations about word count and production cost. Because
It's
paper is not
true.
cheap. Um, for certain. I always like to talk about this in terms of reading. Who are you reading right now?
um, that's so I'm reading this really interesting book. It's called A Fistful of Seashells.
Oh,
And
I think I've heard
it,
of that. Yeah.
it's about Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and really breaking from what's the sort of European colonial version of kind of the history of the continent of Africa, and breaking down it was this continent of extraordinarily complex ecosystems, economies, and trade in all sorts of ways, and the effect that that had really on Europe and its global influence, as opposed to the more sort of European centered history that's sort of like life began at, during the atrocities of the Atlantic slave trade, and it fills in this like much richer history, complex, advanced. Um, it's utterly fascinating, and I just wanted to kind of educate myself more on the subject. That reading that and Raymond Chandler. I've been on a Raymond Chandler kick.
No, that's very good. That's very good. It's always important. I always tell people as a writer, it's always very important to read. So,
Very
uh,
true.
yes, I always ask who is who's reading what and for why and all this type of thing. So this road trip. Um, tell us about tell us about that. Why did you decide to strike out for the territories?
Yeah.
That seems
Um,
like it'd be interesting.
so it was 1996. I had just graduated from school. I worked on a construction site for the summer to save up money, and I had this. No, it was really interesting. There was something I just had to leave the East Coast. I was born and raised in New York, about an hour outside of the city, and there was just something that was constricting about it. And California was this exotic, exotic, far flung place that I just didn't know anything about, and it just seemed kind of magical. And I really had a wanderlust. So I packed up my car and drove across the country. And it's interesting, a bit of the kind of historical piece of that time too. Southern California, Los Angeles had undergone so many upheavals. The East Coast, going to New York City, I would talk to friends. They were working two jobs. They wanted to be an artist because I was moving to Los Angeles to be an artist, and I was really committed to that. But to do that, you want to live as an artist. And I talked with my friends in the city. They were working two jobs. Sometimes they had to get a third job. I mean, they were just like drowning in trying to keep their head above water in Manhattan. I was like, that sounds awful. I arrived in Los Angeles. This was 2 years after Northridge. You had the riots. There was a bit of an economic depression because the aerospace industry had left, because we had kind of won the Cold War. So Clinton had started to close down some military bases, and there weren't any more aerospace contracts. So there was this mass middle class migration out of the state. So I arrived not knowing any of this. I was completely oblivious,
Right.
and it was like Shangri-La. It was there were vacancy signs everywhere. I got a job. I only had to work 3 days a week. I got a job first as a barback, and then bartending, and it was like heaven on earth. And of course, it was Los Angeles, sunny. It's beautiful. I immediately fell in love with the people and the diversity, everything about it. So the road trip was the experience of driving this beat up 1984 Volvo, which was my car. I camped out most of the way, and that also too, just the experiences along the way, the people I met, and that's my driving force artistically. I'm fascinated just with human connection. I think it's everything. I think it's what our survival and our flourishing is all about. And the 90s was a period of time before social media and a lot of the intervention into our lives and the distraction, where we had to do what we're doing now, but we would do it in person. We would just talk. And so that was sort of the genesis of the novel. And the first novel was, I had to get my protagonist from New York to Los Angeles. So it's a road trip novel. And then In Extremis, as I said before, he's now grounded in Los Angeles. And the second novel, it has two timelines. It's 96 to 98 in Los Angeles, and in a very condensed timeline of about 2 days in Big Sur in 2008. And that's these two different portions of the protagonist's life kind of happening in parallel.
Well, yeah, it's how hard was it to quantify LA of the 90s for the second book? Because the second book's all in Los Angeles. So how hard was it to quantify that mood and that vibe?
Um, I did a lot of thinking back and reminiscing, which is I love to do. I think it's a great faculty, spending time and just reminiscing. I've lived here since '96, so I would visit a lot of the old haunts and I'd reconnect with a lot of friends from that period of time. I also read a lot to remind myself because I mean I started in extremis 5 years ago, but it's extraordinary how much time has passed and having to think of things of where technology started to like creep in. Like it was we had Y2K in 2000. So in starting in like 98, people were freaking out and they really started to think it was going to be the end of times in 99 especially. And so to revisit that, I kind of forgotten about that. And then I remembered, I mean, survival, that's real sort of, I think survivalists started a real cottage industry because that was, it was just like, you better get your
My
bug out
dad was
gear.
into that. Yes. Oh my goodness. He had water bladders in the crawl space. He had food stocked up. We had a manual little washer. He was all prepared, all set to go. I thought it was all incredibly ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um it's kind of funny. No one really remembers that anymore. It is totally really kind of faded from memory.
Yeah.
How crazy that was. But yeah, it was nuts.
It was nuts. It really was. I actually, uh, I had a good buddy of mine, his aunt, um, had lived in Maui, and so we went and camped out on her boyfriend's property in Maui and celebrated the millennium um, there. And kind of like you, I just I wasn't I wasn't really into computers. I couldn't afford at that time. I was a bartender, and so I wasn't buying the cutting edge technology, and so I just kind of thought, whatever is will be, but I'm in a beautiful place. And of course, it was like a big fat nothing burger. I mean, it was so kind of laughable for the people who really freaked out.
Yeah, yeah, I think the sad part is that the people who ended up fixing a lot of those issues never really got the press or attention for saving from a major crisis. It was a huge problem. Years later after that, after I'd kind of poo-pooed my dad and everything, I found a congressional hearing about the government allocating $180 million to pay people to go and solve all of these problems for critical infrastructure and all this
Really?
type of thing. Yeah. Um, there's been videos and things that have come out now about the people that fixed that. But yeah, it was quite a problem and still kind of is to some degree because there's a lot of systems that use these legacy systems that are so ancient but incredibly reliable.
That's
And
really interesting.
and so
That's
yeah,
interesting.
so it's a very fascinating thing. It was very my dad works in scientific instrumentation, and both him and my mom were big computer people. They actually met online on a bulletin board in 1992.
Wow, that's a
Yeah,
story.
yeah. And they met up for the first time at a flea market. And, and my mom literally did the drive-by. She's like, "Well, I want to make sure he wasn't a serial killer," and all
She
this.
did. She did the drive by.
He did the drive-by, but yes, yes. And my dad drove a 1970 AMC Javelin, so she's like driving by looking for, the short-bearded man with the javelin, and it's, so um yeah, and the rest is history. Um And so yeah, it was quite a whole thing. So I was very lucky. I grew up with a lot of that. We had, you know, a phone line for the internet, and I was, you know, very, very connected, you know, for that time and that place and that age. And that was not an experience a lot of other people that I of my, you know, age cohort had.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, so that was very much very, very much a thing for us. So weird. I never talk about that, but your work has
I
brought it up.
I think it's like utterly fascinating, and this is super helpful for me because my next novel, I so in extremis, um, covers 96 to 98. So I had just started to really revisit Y2K, and so it's fascinating hearing. I have a character in the novel who is the tech guy, the guy who's like, this is the future. Like, you need to get a domain, you need to get a thing called an email address, um, because it's fascinating. That's just sort of when the groundswell commercially, you know, for like the general public, it started
Yeah.
to kind of take place, and
Oh
then it
God, I
was matched.
remember. I know. I remember. Like we would go to the like we had computers at home, which was not as common as it would become later. But there
Mhm.
was a lot of people that, you know, the computer was something like you went to the library to use, or if you went to university, you had computer labs and all this sort of thing, you know, sort of, and people, you know, and we always joke about, you know, we all had the computer room in our house if you had a computer at home, sort of thing, or it was, you know, in a desk dedicated, you know, somewhere. And like I remember being in school, we had one computer for the whole school. We used it for a few things. We still had books and encyclopedia. I'm old enough that when I was in first grade, a lot of the geography still had East and West Germany, like, you know, sort of thing. The books were still being updated. So it was a very odd time to grow up because I am old enough to remember the old way of doing things, but I have lived in the new way of doing things. So
Mhm.
I both know how to change the DNS on a domain and how to dial a rotary telephone. Like, you know, I know what a
I
phone book is. I used to deliver phone books. Like, and I've had young people ask me, how did you guys find information? Well, you're gonna laugh. The phone company wrote it all up, printed it on paper, and delivered it to our houses. In fact, I was the man who brought your phone book to your house for a while. That
you
was a
would
good business. I made a lot of money at that.
you would meet someone and you would say, oh, their last name was Thomas. You'd grab the phone book because
Yeah.
you know, oh, oh, we didn't get their phone number. You'd grab the phone book and you'd go through Thomas's, and you could like
Yes.
whittle it down.
Yes,
um
yes. Or if you had
I
their address, you'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's the, and at this address,
Yeah,
that's them," and call them. Yes, and yeah, and that's,
I
you
I
know,
used to go I used to go to the Hollywood Library. I mean, I got a laptop, but before that I went to the Hollywood Library, and then when I was acting, we would get um uh you would get your sides, they would be faxed to you, so you had a fax machine. That
yeah.
was the big communication. You had your, you know, receive your facts every day. And what, it's so funny what you're saying right here is when my mom moved from New York and they were packing up the house, I said, we have encyclopedias from 1978. And I said,
Yeah.
I, I want, I want the encyclopedias because they're frozen in time. And so like what you were saying, you know, I read this and it's, you know, you read about the USSR and all of these, you know, bits of history just totally frozen in that space and time. And I love, I'll pick a random subject and just to read about how history was told at that moment in time. And, you know, I love that, those kinds of artifacts.
No, no, absolutely. I enjoy that as well. I'm for another writing project I'm writing that I'm working on. I'm reading about the Soviet economy, and I picked up a used book from the mid 80s about the Soviet economy and all this sort of thing, and it's all very, you know, kind of learning its ins and outs for this other project I'm working on.
Wow.
Um and it is very interesting. I'm actually the one I have here that I actually found at an antique sale. Um was a book called, it was My 4 Years in Germany by James Gerard. It was his experience in World War One, and I bought it immediately because on the first page he perfectly predicts World War Two. On the first paragraph. First paragraph, first page, he says, "We will be fighting these people again, and let me tell you why." And I'm kind of like,
Wow.
well, I'm sold, Mr. 1919, tell me more. And so yeah, it is that stuff is endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, that's it. I think one thing I'm very sad that the internet hasn't done is the internet is very bad at preserving information. Ironically, it was invented to preserve
Mm.
it better. And does a very bad job of it, and things disappear and aren't there, and
Hmm.
internet archive and the Wayback Machine can only do so much, and it's and also I don't know if you feel this as well or how your experience with the internet was, but the the writing and stuff you used to be able to get online was wonderful. I mean, just the stuff that I mean, especially like, in like the adult space, the written erotica that you could access
Hmm.
was just wonderful. I mean, just all this
Hmm.
stuff, and it's all gone now. It's
Hmm.
all gone. But mostly because social media and platforms have
Yeah.
absorbed all of it. It's all on Wattpad now or Tumblr, all this type of thing. Um, and so yeah, and it's a lot of that's gone now, and the culture has totally changed.
Yeah.
So
There was we experienced the sort of the infancy, and there was this really bit of an incredible innocence. Like you're saying, how
oh
writing was
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so prevalent. Blogs, you had mentioned, erotica, short stories. Well, blogs were really that's what really took off. And then as
Forums.
media
Oh my goodness, forums. Yes.
forums. So in my novel, I talk about Halley's Comet, and when Halley's Comet, and it was in '98, and how these incredible forums were created where people all around the country were sharing their photos and writing their stories. And then the same thing also happened with Princess Diana. And that was like one of the first times that everyone could globally meet in these forums online and grieve and talk about it. I think that's an interesting insight. I think over time, as everything has become more and more visual, and I record myself, and I think in that sense too, very much more self-centered, about like me, sharing this, that the writing piece has definitely disappeared.
Yeah, well, that goes along with, reduced attention spans and
Yeah.
all this
Mhm.
sort of
And yeah.
yeah, it's a very difficult it's a very difficult thing. But yeah, the way social media has killed the internet as we once knew it,
Hmm.
um, is a conversation we don't have enough. There was a great post long time ago now from a guy in Iran. He'd just gotten out of prison for saying things Tehran did not like, and he was talking, and he had kind of, when he'd gone in, social media was just starting, and when he got out, it had hit its stride, and he was kind of like, do you guys not all understand all of this is going behind, into these walled gardens owned by these companies? This is not the internet, sort of. And it went viral. It
Yeah.
was called The Death of the Hyperlink. It went instantly
Hmm.
viral. Also, it's like, yeah, yes, I tried to have him on the show at the time.
Hmm.
It's like, yes, 110%. Yes, that is all happening, and it's not great. And yeah,
Yeah.
it was a difficult, a difficult thing. So, um, especially for platforms like Instagram that don't allow a lot of links beyond bio and all this type of thing, it really becomes a walled garden.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
which gets us all into conversations about data and privacy and all this type of thing, which is not anything to do with your book. So, um, yeah, so why don't you tell us about the third one that's coming along? What's coming next?
I haven't even started it. That's why this conversation is really fun, because my focus has been
Well, it says the series is not to be done to 2030, so you have 6 years to go. So I guess we'll be patient.
yeah, exactly. But this is what I'm really enjoying this conversation so much, because it's getting my gears going. I'm giving pretty much this year off to just I'm doing the marketing for In Extremis. I'm planning to publish it within the next 2 to 3 weeks, and it was a bear. It was 5 years, and so I feel like I have to fill my cup back up. Um, and so I'm going to spend the rest of this year doing just a lot of reading and going back in time, and my character now will experience Y2K, and then of course 9/11, which for me, my character's he's Gen X. That was, in my opinion, a true defining moment for Gen X, and so
No, I even
that's
find the older part of my millennial cohort was affected very differently. I was 13 when it happened. And to be very blunt, and I tell people this, so I don't mind saying it, I didn't care at the time. Um, I, however, for the 10-year anniversary, I produced a play about Flight 93, which was written by
oh,
the man who wrote the screenplay for the movie. Um, and actually, Paramount paid for the play because they bought all the rights to the script except the live theater rights for it, and he used the money that he sold the screenplay to finance the play. And we got to do it in a small theater. We had major casting issues because people couldn't handle it, and
mm,
people we I actually went through two complete casts by the time it was all said and done. The
wow.
people I started with is not the people that I ended with.
Mm,
So except for my terrorists. They endured, but everyone else came and went. I did other shows. I was big into community theater at the time. I did other shows, and people were like, "Oh my God, I could have never done that. I would never be able to handle all this type of thing." And I didn't really realize how it had emotionally affected people
mm,
until I sat with those audience because we did Q&A after every showing of the movie,
mm.
and and how it had affected the screenwriter, how it affected the people and the audiences and all this stuff. And it really kind of hit. I had basically a decade-long delay, um,
Yeah.
and it really kind of hit home. But even I find like I know someone who's only a couple years older than me, but it she was 15 when it happened.
Mhm.
Totally different experience.
So,
Totally.
Cameron, where were you when you were 13 and 9/11 happened? What state?
I actually was nowhere near the action. We were visiting my grandparents on Flathead Lake in Montana.
Oh wow, you were in Montana. See, yeah, I was
Yeah.
in California, so I think that's very fair and honest to say. And this is something,
And I grew up in
um,
Denver and Colorado. I hadn't even been to New York City at that time.
yeah, I think
So
that's really, yeah.
I was it was very removed from my
Hmm.
whole experience. And it was just kind of like, yes, this terrible thing is happening. People have died, but it's over now, near as I can tell. And so it just, but I mean, I'm still amazed at the absolutely visceral emotional reaction that it provokes in people and the memories and all this type of thing, which I sadly did not share at the time and didn't really understand until 10 years later when I did a show about it, which I suppose is the transformative power of theater,
Hmm.
even for those of us
Hmm.
who are producing it. And so, yeah, it was definitely very far away. So,
It was an interesting experience for me because I was in Los Angeles, but born and raised in New York. Um, and so it was really difficult to feel so entirely helpless. I had friends who, um, they worked in the city. They were in the you know they had friends who worked in the in the towers, and um, but being 3,000 miles away, just it was this strange feeling of like almost like floating in outer space, because all I was doing was just watching this on TV and then making phone calls to check on family
yeah.
and friends.
Oh, good luck making a long distance phone call that day. The lines were so
Yeah,
bad. Good luck.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then also, so I'm 50, so I was, in my 20s at that time, and that's so there's a reality to how much you're affected by something, um, by virtue of age, which I think is also like very fair and honest. But I think that for the United States, it's a part of what sort of changed the course of where we go every single way, shape, and form, from popping the bubble of a certain, I think uh, we were we were very protected from uh, uh, opinions of the outside world on who we are, our values, and um, uh, seething anger. Really, we were sort of, kind of living in this bubble, and that bubble
No,
was
I
popped.
talk about I talk about that in a couple across a couple different projects. When I write about Pax Americana from 1991, the end of the Cold War, to 2001, with the arrival of international terrorism. And for me, I have, because I was a child, for that I was 3 to 13, I have this sort of childhood view of it.
Hmm.
So I find this very interesting because you have will have had a more adult view because you were older than I, view of it, in that time. And so I think it's interesting that you talk about that. And I don't think, people really, realize and think, like, yeah, it's like a lot of the stuff that we talk about, those weren't, we didn't even have those dialogues back then. We didn't have the language. It wasn't talked about, or even the idea of kind of like the news was not all pervasive. We sat down at 6 o'clock on Channel 7 in
Hmm.
Denver to watch ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, of all people, who was Canadian. And then it was from 6 to 6. It was the local
Yeah.
was from 5 to 6. The national was from 6 to 6:30, and then we watched Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune and went on with our lives. Like that was it. Like we've been updated. We know what's going on, then we move on with ourselves. um,
I think it's
I
so interesting to hear, you're,
yeah,
because I never would have thought of or considered, like the perspective of a 13-year-old. And that's utterly, to me, that's just totally fascinating. It's a fascinating lens to look back on that, because I have a very limited lens, because it's my experience.
right.
I haven't talked about 9/11 in such a long time. And then I feel like, it was, which unfortunately this speaks to the dark side of human nature. It just didn't take long before it went into like very serious conspiracy theories, and it sort of just moved away from the the pure piece of the fact of this was an attack, and the effect on the psyche of the United States, and the people in the United States, where it was just like, holy shit, it wasn't since Pearl Harbor. The United States had, for all intents and purposes, won the Cold War. And so we were sitting like fat cats, and again, speaking, this is something I think that's, it's my opinion. I've certainly I've had conversations with people who have a variety of different opinions, but for me, that it was a bit of this, like, spoiled time. I mean, things were really good. The economy was booming. Um, good in these general
Jobs were
senses, and
easier
then
to get. Housing was way
all
cheaper.
of the above.
Like, yeah,
Clinton, and like, I'm not saying it was like life was perfect. We know about inequalities and all of that stuff. I'm saying in this general sense, like in, the first world, you had Congress was actually, Gingrich and Clinton were actually accomplishing a hell of a lot. You had like a functioning Congress, like what you're saying about housing, jobs. We would bitch, but I mean, it was silly bitching. I mean,
yeah.
it was like, times were really good. And then
No, I think
this,
younger people are really amazed when people, like of your generation talk about like, yeah, I just showed up to a town one day and found a job doing something. Everyone's kind of like, you did what now? Because
yep,
that's not that way anymore at all. The culture on that has totally changed. It's kind of like, no, it really did used to be that easy. I mean, I'm sad to
yeah,
say, but yeah, it really was. Like
yeah,
you could just show up, just kind of, show up and fill out your paper application and have something within a couple of weeks,
yeah,
sort of thing.
yep,
You could figure it out. And, nowadays, a job loss, even if you're a bartender, can be a devastating life event,
Yeah.
resulting
And
in living with friends, family, and or homelessness, or all of the above. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a very different
And
world.
and the that bartending gig today is not, you're not working 3 days a week and paying your rent. I did. I had
Yeah.
a studio apartment that was at the base of AFI, right? I could bike up to Griffith Park, and my rent was $375 a month. Los Angeles in the 90s was, the cost of living was half of what it was in New York, because there was a confluence of all of these events, principally Northridge. Northridge terrified Southern California. I mean, people left the state to never come back. They went to Montana, Colorado, Idaho. And then, like I had mentioned before, there was um, uh, an economic depression, jobs, all of these military contracts were ended because, again, I mean, we had pretty
And you
much
and you
the
and you had huge swaths of land that needed redevelopment,
yep,
and then you'd had Rodney King riots, and that was a whole
yeah,
thing. And
yeah. I mean,
yeah.
you had the Rodney King beating, and then the riots that ensued after that, where the National Guard was brought in, and I mean, people died, billions of dollars of damage. There were a couple of years of horrific wildfires. I mean, it was literally. I mean, I joke in my novel about it. The Raiders like packed up and left town, and I joke,
Yeah.
like, because it was like so bad.
No, I mean,
But if you
I know
rolled into
I
town, then
watched no, I watched those two really good documentaries about the Rodney King riots, and I mean, watching, VHS footage because someone had a camera of standing in an apartment building in Beverly Hills, watching basically the rest of the city burn, because there were so many fires and all this sort of thing is just an eerie thing. I
and it
love
was
Southern
also
California. I can't stand California. The state's so poorly run. I would be in Sacramento every day screaming at them, I can't live in California. But I've been to Southern California many times. It's lovely there. If the state were run differently, I could live there. But I would be the crazy guy arrested for being like, please, would you run your state properly?
oh, I no no no. I hear you, and a lot of
Which
people,
is why I live in the
trust me,
East.
a lot of Californians are shaking their fists and yelling. Interesting fact, and this is sort of how I maintain my sanity living in the state, because I love the state, warts and all. And I trust me, I bet we would be on the same, more on the same page. We'd be in more agreement than disagreement with the issues, with the state. And we in California we call it the weather tax. You deal with all of this crap because
The
like the
weather
weather
is
is just
phenomenal. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you can't beat it. But what's interesting for my novels, I've had to sort of be engrossed in reading the history of California, and interestingly, the identity of the history of the state of California is pretty much this boom or bust an environment. And it's sort of like from the beginning, politically, economically, it goes through decades of these pendulum swings. And so anyway, that's sort of what helps me maintain my sanity as we go through
No, no. I
some of
mean,
those swings.
no, there's very interesting stuff. We could get into Upton Sinclair running for governor in 35 and the movie studios foiling him and spending gobs of money during the Depression because he wanted to create the movie studios as a workers' co-op, and all the big studio heads were still alive, and they spent $2 million, which in 1935 was a huge amount of money, to make sure he did not become governor. That whole history is absolutely
Hmm.
fascinating. And even the stuff with Mulholland and the water system that allows
Oh
Los
yeah.
Angeles to exist is always fascinating to me. I was in the area a couple years ago, and I was driving through the Central Valley, and I actually took a wrong turn and ended up going on some country roads to get back to the road I needed to be on. Which I figured out very quickly. I wasn't worried. I'm like, oh, I just go here, and I mean, I grew up in Colorado in a rural area, so I'm like, oh, give me a dirt country road. I go here, turn left at the stop sign. I'm good to go. Fantastic, let's do it. So I had to do that because I took a wrong turn and going through the orchards, all this type of thing, and I hadn't been down there in a while, so it's kind of nice to get out into
Hmm.
the world. Um, and I've been down there and I was kind of like, I could live here if it was better run. I could absolutely. I got to spend the summer in San Diego on Coronado Island, and it was absolutely magical.
Yeah.
Um in fact, the summer of 2001, before 9/11, we were in San Diego, actually.
Mm,
Um, and
hmm,
so it was absolutely magical and amazing. And I got to meet a
mhm.
woman whose husband was involved in the occupation of Japan during World War II, and she lived in Japan for 20 years.
Oh my
And
God.
her and I used to
Huh.
correspond for year until she passed. Um,
Wow.
yeah, Mrs. Jordan.
Wow.
It was really cool. And that's why I love California. I wish Gavin Newsom would fix it, because then I could move.
Yeah.
I
Well,
could
but
move from rainy and cloudy Delaware. But
this is the thing that's interesting is from when I moved here in the 90s, I've talked with this about this with some friends. It's sort of like the migration back into the state took place because people realized, wait a second, things are pretty good. And I mean, I can't emphasize enough how cheap it was to live here. And I mean, there were vacancy signs everywhere. And I mean, it's like what you were saying. I mean, the only reason you wouldn't have a job is if you were lazy. You could hand your resume anywhere
yeah.
and you would be hired. Um, but that's built up. And now, everything is just so out of whack from housing to our homeless crisis, which is it's an incredible crisis.
No, I
It's
mean
the
and
proportion
it's
of it.
really sad because people, come on online and talk about, oh, I can't afford to live all this type of thing. And the first question is, do you live in California? Yes, there's only one thing you can do. You're gonna love Tucson. You're gonna love Phoenix. Have you thought about Scottsdale? Um, Give Vegas a try. But whatever you do, if you're not finding something to hack it, the best thing you can do for yourself, very unfortunately, is get the hell out of California. And that's a sad
So
thing to say.
I I so co-sign to what you say. The thing of saying and um, I can't afford to live here. I can't do this that. When I moved from New York, it's why I left New York because I knew Los Angeles. Los Angeles. It's what's also interesting in the '90s. There was still like this thing of like, oh, Los Angeles, out
Oh yeah.
there. Like the New York Times didn't have a open up a shop to do consistent concerted reporting on California, which it's like the eighth largest economy of the world. I mean, it's as far as the states go, it's its own country. They didn't do that until I want to say within the last decade. But if I was living today, and I just graduated college, I wouldn't even think of California. Wouldn't even think of New York. We have 50 states. And if you're an artist, you can make your way and then you create your art. You be part of the next generation of the wow of whatever it is. But there's 50 states to choose from. And I think, you can't be blinded by the ideal or idea of, yeah, of course, Los Angeles, entertainment capital of the world, but you have North Carolina, there's a small arts movement in Maine. Um, Georgia. I mean, you can make your
I was gonna
way
say,
anywhere.
I briefly considered moving to Atlanta. I lived in Seattle for 10 years. Seattle was my getting out of Colorado, and it took me a long time to get there because I never thought I would leave Denver. And I was very invested, and I had worked in nightlife and had done events and parties, and I have had friends there, still have dear friends there, a lot of family there, all this type of thing. I never thought I would move. And Denver's great, but when it comes to creativity, it's a small cow town. Don't let the skyscrapers
Mm-hmm.
fool you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a lot of people being like, you need to go someplace bigger where they can, and I had always had a trouble getting jobs in Denver. I never was dating in Denver, all this, it was all very difficult. So I decided to go to Seattle. I lived there for 10 years, and then I came here to Delaware to be close to New York. I can't live in New York, but I can afford to live close, and so hence Delaware. Um, and because when I was 18, I wanted to just move to New York and be an interior designer. And at that time, way back in 2006, I'm 36 on Friday. Way back in 2006, it was not sustainable back then, and it's only gotten worse
Yeah.
in the interim
Yeah.
18 years. Um, and so yeah, but now when I was leaving Seattle last year, I really looked at Atlanta because Atlanta is a wonderful, especially for television, is a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful scene. It's great. So you're absolutely right. There's a different. It's not all stuck in New York and LA anymore. There's opportunity elsewhere.
hmm It's there's truth in what you're saying. I kind
Which
of
is
the
why my
one
mom
bit.
thinks I should move back to Denver.
I mean, I mean, there's, obviously some states, locations, places you go, they're not going to have that creative energy and life. And there's truth to that. But there are more hubs now. So actually, I know Delaware and Maryland as well. Maryland, I've heard, Baltimore, a lot of young creative energy there. I just
So
think,
New York has gotten so expensive. A lot of people, one of the reasons I came here, a lot of people have left New York for Philly, for here in Wilmington,
mm,
for Baltimore. I actually, just here in the 6 months I've been here, there's a really great documentary filmmaker who lives upstairs. He's
mm,
doing a series on about a guy who was falsely convicted for a crime in Philly right now for HBO
mm,
Max. He lives upstairs from me. I met a guy who does animation and voiceover at a bar here in Wilmington, sort of thing. I've been impressed with the amount of creative people
mm.
working in the industry here in Wilmington, Delaware. Who'd have thunk? The city
Yeah. But
famous
see, I
for being
love
the home
that.
of Joe Biden. I mean, so I mean, yeah, I mean, it's there is a lot, and the other great thing about being here is I can be in Philadelphia in the
Mm,
next half hour. And
right.
there's actually a creative collective called REC in Philadelphia. I don't need their services because I'm not a musician or a filmmaker, but I mean, there's probably 200 people that have joined that and are making stuff and networking and all this type of thing. I mean, it's so I mean, really and I think part of it is because New York is the hub and you ultimately want to get there, but we can't afford to be there, so we're doing it out here in the hopes that we
hmm
one day might get there. But that also allows people to network and survive and do and work and all this type of thing. And so there's this kind of wonderful. The bubble's gotten bigger. It's extended
Yeah.
beyond just the island of Manhattan out to the whole region. And I think that's really kind of remarkable too.
I'm a big believer and supporter in that. I think artists, I can only speak from my own experience. You have to be in an environment where you have to be able to flourish, explore,
Yeah.
create, and you can't do that if you're drowning in debt, if you're drowning in stress, barely able to keep your head above water. And so, you have to, think of those environments where you can, and sure, there's pros and cons to anything anywhere, but if you make those connections, I mean, really everything that you were saying, you start to just find those networks where you're at, and next thing you know, you start to have this energy that comes from these connections. And also too, I mean, this is what's beautiful about how we're the way that we're connected today. You can connect online, you can create and share online. When I started off, after I was acting, and I didn't like the lack of creative control, so I started to write and direct my own material. And it was as YouTube just came onto the scene, and so that was my sort of like film school. In the early days of YouTube, I was really lucky. I had a series, and it took off on YouTube. But that was for me so freeing because I could shoot something, short form content, and have potentially the world watch it. And so that I think is one of the real positives of our connected world today. And for young artists,
No,
that I
this
think can.
podcast is heard on every inhabited continent. The Cameron Jones heard on every inhabited continent. Um, I used to say all seven continents, but the person who used to read me from McMurdo Station moved home, so we're no longer in Antarctica, but we're everywhere else. And I'm always amazed at where people find this and all this sort of thing. That is one of the things about the modern technology that is really great that was not possible back then, you know.
Yeah,
And
I mean, like I really appreciate being able to have this conversation. And you're in Delaware and I'm in California. It's a beautiful thing.
yeah, yeah. It absolutely is. And that is, and yes, I mean, I did a recording earlier today with someone who's just in Philadelphia. I could have had him here. He's so close by. Um, and then, but then also in the same day to speak to you in California.
hmm
Is tremendous. And I mean, I've always worked, the internet has allowed me to work globally when I was a freelance writer and everything, doing content for brands and whatnot. I got to do business all over the world. in India, the
Hmm.
Middle East, Europe. In fact, right now I'm working on a deal to bring us Australian brand of water fountains to North America. Um, and in another day and time, that would be very difficult to communicate with the team in Australia. And now it's a Google Meet. I mean, that's magical at some
It's
point.
magical.
Yeah, I remember when my dad went to Australia in 1996. We had a phone card. It was like 23 cents a minute. It was by satellite, so there was a delay. And it was like, okay, talk to dad for like 5 minutes, and then we're hanging up because it's too expensive. Meanwhile, I had an hour and a half meeting with Australia last week for a cost of zero. That's happened
it's
in my lifetime. That's nuts. Like,
it's nuts and it's amazing.
it
Like what a
is.
great way. That's such a great illustration for like what technology has given us in that short of a period of time.
Yeah, no, it is it's absolutely crazy, what has what has happened in such a short period of time. And I can only think back to the young you in 1996 arriving afresh in LA and just like walking up to him and playing this conversation to be like, this is gonna be your life in 25 years.
Oh my God, that would be a trip. I mean,
Yeah.
he didn't that guy he didn't know his ass from his elbow. The only thing he really had was passion uh, and a drive to figure things out. But
Hey, you were
you
ahead
know,
of me. I was still learning multiplication tables. So so
I will say I was really lucky though. Like I said, that period of time, it's my fascination that that thing of you look back 20 years ago and you start to see it in a framing that when you're in it, um, it it's you're just existing. It's part of your life. So you don't understand the ramifications, the context. But then when you look back, and I think that that period of time of the late '90s before 2001 was this really sort of a special time. And
no,
um,
and one of the reasons why I love this project and I was so attracted to it is I have been patiently waiting for the literature about that period to come out. Um, I was patiently waiting for literature about the Afghanistan war to come out too, and it started to come out. And in fact, there was a great book I used to sell about it that was wars are terrible things, but they make for great books. And one of the reasons I was very attracted to this is because it's like finally we're getting the literature about this time. And we're talking about it in the ways that we talked about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and now we're talking about the 90s in this way. And so I was very attracted to this because it's kind of like, yes, we're finally gotten enough distance that people can write about it. Um, and later this year, my book America's Lost Generation is coming out, where I write about millennials and the financial crisis and what happened afterwards. Um, and it was and that book took longer to write. I started in 2020. I finished it this year. It took 4 years to write. I thought it would only take two. I had
wait, this is a book that you wrote?
Well, yes, it's a nonfiction book about the economy and millennials and what happened, and it looks through the millennials through the
Oh, I
lens
would
of their
love to
Japanese
read that.
cousins from the Japanese financial crisis of 1991,
Oh, wow. Huh.
and kind of painting an unfortunate harbinger of the future. But yeah, it will be out in September. And it was, I think, that I also getting the distance so that I could look back with a different view was very important and talk about the last, but when I first started writing the last decade or so, now about the last 15
Yeah,
years or so of all that has happened and how we kind of got here to today, sort of thing. Um
that'll be
and
fascinating.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to read that when you put it out there.
Yeah, but I'm excited to hear, literature from the early aughts, and literature about that and how that, because you get they make the movies really fast, and the movies are just kind of a fictional record of what happened, but with
Hmm.
time you get the memories, you get the feelings, you get that in French philosophy we call it jouissance, which loosely translated means essence of life or joy of
Mm.
life. Um, that takes time. And so one of the things I love about your book is that sufficient time has passed that we get to look at that time through a very different lens. And the main character is very compelling, and all this sort of thing. So yeah, I like that aspect of it. So you've done very well.
Well, thank you. And I'm excited to share In Extremis with you. I will be sending you an email the moment it's published, because I would be eager to have a conversation or hear your thoughts on that when it comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're past the hour. We've overtalked, um, as we're sometimes wont to do on this show when the conversation is good. Um, so why don't you tell us where we can find you online, where we can buy the book?
Sure. So Ostraca is out. It's on Amazon, and that's Ostraca, Ostraca. And In Extremis, like I said, will be published within the next 3 weeks. But for both, you can visit my website as well outside of Amazon, which is www.mattduggan.com, MattDuggan. And that has all of the information about both the novels, along with inspiration and my bio as well.
Yes, yes. And I love that you put the triple W in front. No one says that anymore. I love it.
I
That's very
had,
nostalgic.
what was so great about that? As I was saying it, it was like, wow, I'm like completely stamping my age here.
No, but that's the vibe of this that's why it's so perfect. That is the vibe we have created. So I love it. It was exactly the perfect thing to say.
Oh, good,
So,
good, good.
all right. Well, thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you letting me talk with you.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.